Hi, this is my review of Mystic Forces 2nd edition. Mystic Forces is a very unique fantasy role-playing game. It's going to challenge many of the things that you would consider normal or standard in a fantasy role-playing game. The setting and many of the creatures that are found in Mystic Forces feel completely different from what you see in a normal fantasy game, and even here on planet Earth, some of the things feel quite weird and alien. And the level of power that is handled in Mystic Forces, it feels quite elevated. It feels like it delves into the realms of demigodhood or even godhood at the highest level of power. Now let's talk about the quality of the PDF. But before that, if you're interested in getting the physical book, it's available on softcover version and hardcover version on a print-on-demand basis. And when it comes to the PDF, the quality is great. It's fully bookmarked, although I think a few more bookmarks in certain of the more extensive sections of the rulebook would have been useful. And the rules are very well explained, although this is a very deep and complex system in the best of the sense of the term. So if you don't understand a rule after reading a paragraph or two, just keep on reading and things will make sense. And at the end of the book, you have a lot of sheets to run everything smoothly. You have obviously a character sheet, but you also have a combat sheet, a Dragonknight sheet, enchanter sheet, etc, etc. There are just a lot of sheets. If you need them, you won't need to use all of them, but if you ever have the need to track down something or do a bit of bookkeeping, they are there, so that's quite nice. And the illustrations of the book are really beautiful. They are in black and white and full color, and I really like the full color illustrations because they kind of look like a fantasy mural of sorts. And the artist played with the perspective and dimensionality in the sense that it feels like he combined 3D and 2D at the same time. So that's quite nice. Now let's talk about the contents of the Mystic Forces. There's a lot of content. They are 367 pages, just filled with setting details and rules. Let's start with the setting because the setting is quite interesting and unique. You see a universe very different from ours. There are some similarities, but it kind of feels like it has its own laws of astrophysics, so to speak. And you see these deity-like creatures or concepts, and this is one of the most unique things of the game, in my opinion. Many of the other fantasy role-playing games handle deities and gods that are very much like humans. It feels like humans with more power and wisdom, but here you have these ancient things called life sources that feel more akin to mathematical formula, so to speak. And it tells the story of this life force that in its last moments started to create life in this astral body, or this well, it's pretty much a planet called the Oriathar. And you start getting into this philosophical debate of whether of the purpose of creating something, of existence, or the senselessness. So it feels quite philosophical. And then this life force begins to get attacked by these sun wraiths. That is, these sort of like entities hovering around the sun, and they become hungry when they sense this life force and attack the life force. And in order to protect itself, the life force kind of fuses with the planet, with Oriathar, to protect itself. And then life is being produced. Many creatures and formations that are these spires of elemental power, because the Mystic Forces have a lot to do with the elements. That is, the elements of fire, water, air, land, and spirit. And these spires regulate all the mystic forces are within the planet and around it. and intelligent life begins to appear. You see a very deep and complex genesis in this setting, and the intelligent races begin to discover how to wield the mystic forces in a lesser degree at first, but there's also corruption. An inexplicable corruption starts appearing in Oreathar, and it starts turning natural creatures into evil creatures, because all of the creatures here feel quite alien, or most of them do. And the corrupted creatures start attacking the intelligent races of the planet. And some of the creatures are pure corruption, that is corruption that has taken flesh, that has taken form, and they start wreaking havoc. And it's a big mystery. Almost nobody can explain what this corruption represents, or where it came from. You see several belief systems. Some systems consider the original life force to be a divine conscience, and they consider corruptions to be a sort of like a sickness within this conscience. But there's also a belief system that says that the corruption is being provoked or created by this life force in order to kill the intelligent life on the planet. So you see this conflict, this opposition of different ideals. So the intelligent races are almost destroyed by the corruption until the Shinkai appear. And the Shinkai are basically, they're kind of like super warrior wizards. They are almost divine beings within the intelligent races that put a stand against the corruption, because they are able to wield the mystic forces in incredible ways. And then also the dragons appear, and these dragons seem to be like natural enemies of the corruption, but they are not friends of the other races and the Shinkai. That is, if someone gets in the way of a dragon, the dragon is going to eat that being or kill it. So it's a very conflictive setting. And worst of all, some of the Shinkai become corrupted. They become the Korgathul, and they start attacking other Shinkai and aiding the corruption. So it's a big conflict, and one of the Korgathul especially becomes very powerful because he engages in forbidden practices on wielding the mystic forces. He starts to drain all the spires, and many other corrupted Shinkai start draining the elemental spires, and they become really strong, but they also become quite mad, quite insane. And there even comes a time where the dragons participate in this conflict. In fact, it's thanks to a dragon that this evil Korgathul or corrupt Shinkai is defeated. But because of the interaction between the mystic forces, the dragons, and the Shinkai, some Shinkai become able to transform into dragons. They become Dragon Knights. And at the end, they actually manage to fight off the corruption, but the corruption is still there, waiting to take an advantage, to take control of the entire planet of Oreathar. So there's a lot of room for it's just bursting with adventure seeds for your own campaign. And this is just a very reduced version of the setting. This is a small summary of what it is. I'm leaving a lot of details out of my description, so you can just imagine the depth of the setting. And the entire universe just feels so alien. It feels a bit like in the level of Carcosa, but somewhat different, or even similar to the astonishing swordsmen and sorcerers of Hyperborea. But here, for example, the moon, it doesn't orbit. Here the celestial bodies don't orbit around the sun. The moon is just there, and the phases change because there are these cosmic gases that cover the moon at times. So it's a very alien universe. You should read it in detail, because there are many things that you take for granted based on our own solar system that are different here. And when it comes to the more details of the setting, you have information on the politics, on the geography, on the belief systems, on the factions, because for example the defenders are Shinkai who are fighting the corruption. You have all the benefits for belonging to that organization. And then let's talk about character creation. Character creation is quite deep and yet somewhat simple at the same time, because here you don't have a bunch of character classes. You could say that you only have two: Dragon Knights and Enchanters. And Dragon Knights are very powerful warriors that can change into dragons. Not all the time, and there is a certain limit, but when they do, they turn into a dragon and they are impressive in all sorts of battles. They even have ranged attacks. I will talk about that a bit more later on. And enchanters are just like the masters of wielding the mystic forces on sort of like impregnating things with the seed of the mystic force and creating different magical effects, both offensive and defensive, and attuning to the mystic forces in ways that other beings in the planet cannot. And when you, after you choose a race, you will get different attribute points and health stats and movement, etc. But let's talk a bit more about the races, because the races, as I was telling you, they are quite different from what would you expect in a fantasy role-playing game. First, you have the GRAK, and they're kind of like these dwarvish, horned dwarvish creatures that are very tough and sturdy and have an awesome battle rage. And all of the races here have very unorthodox colors. That is, you're going to find beings with different skin and hair color. Some of them are green, some of them are completely black and such. And you also have the LOREMEK, and you see these beings that are kind of like bald with it's kind of like flamingo or ostrich-like legs. They're quite weird, and they are very fast and moving. And you also have the Morgen, which are kind of like these halfling-like beings with very large ears and these sort of like flaps that fall down their necks, and they actually breathe through those flaps. And they don't have noses, they have just a strange mark on their faces. And then you have the Nafzir, which are kind of like lizard people with poisonous claws, and they have no ears. You also have the VALKIN, which are kind of like cat people of sorts. The WARLUM, which are very tough individuals with knots on their skin. They have very tough skin, are very resistant to damage and stun effects. And you have the Jakra, which are basically like goat men with a third eye. They look somewhat diabolical. So all of these are the standard races. As you can see, there is no human-like race, because in many other fantasy role-playing games you always have a race that looks like a human, but supposedly they are not. But here all the races feel more like demi-humans. And after recording all of your stats for weapons, armor, etc., you also need to choose a specialty. Well, that's one of the first steps, but I thought that it would be a bit easier to explain all of the other details first. And a specialty has talents, so that way your character could specialize in archery, or being a scout, or using edged melee weapons, or maybe an expert in unarmed combat. And all of the talents serve as sort of like skill trees, so to speak, although they are not skills. We'll get into skills in a bit. And these talents allow you to further specialize in each of the specialties. And you also get to choose secondary specialties, which are a bit more expensive when you level up, because this is a point-buy system. So your character doesn't feel like boxed into a certain role, but there is a way to focus on specific tasks at hand. When it comes to skills, you have a good variety of skills, but what I like about the skills here is that they actually have a strong impact in battle. They are not just used outside of combat. There are many general combat skills that you can develop, so you have an edge when fighting. So that's quite nice. And now let's talk about the rules, the core rules of this role-playing game. The system is generally simple. It's based on attribute tests. You either have to do an attribute test or a random attribute test. And attributes here are categorized by levels of power. So according to your level, you're going to roll a certain number of dice. You use polyhedral dice in this game, and you need to reach a certain number. But for example, when you carry out an attribute test, you add the level of power of your attribute and you roll your dice as indicated by that level of power. But when it's a random attribute test, and this happens when you are, for example, surprised or performing something when you didn't expect to be doing something. So for example, maybe it's very different from trying to find something as to suddenly noticing something. Maybe there's something shining in the distance and it caught your attention, and that's a random attribute test, and that you also roll your dice, but you do not add the level of your attribute. And there's also the performance test, which can be applied to attribute and random attribute tests. Performance is basically rolling a 12-sided die, and you get something good or something bad. So for example, if you roll a 1, it's a feeble attempt, and that's very bad. And if you roll a 12, it's a flawless performance, and you may even succeed at tests that you thought was otherwise impossible. So that's the basic mechanic of the entire system, although the different parts of combat and the classes of Shinkai or types of Shinkai, it feels like there are different subsystems that flow from that base mechanic. Now when it comes to combat, the initiative system is quite intuitive and organic, and at the same time requires a lot of game master discretion. So initiative is basically this: you have a fixed number. If you're performing a physical action, you use your physical initiative, and if you're using the mystic forces, which is kind of like the magic in this game, then you use your mystical initiative, which has to do with your sixth sense value. And it's a bit more involved than that, in the sense that, for example, maybe your character is a scout type of character, and you're moving through a rocky mountainside, and you see this enemy before you, and you're not sure how to act. If you, for example, decide to charge at your enemy with your sword, maybe even if you have a physical initiative that is higher than your enemy, because you are running towards that enemy, it could be a very bad thing, because your enemy could be faster in his mystical initiative, or maybe instead of charging at you, your enemy is using a ranged weapon, so the initiative would be given to that enemy. So maybe it would be a bit more prudent to take cover behind some rocks and try to move towards that enemy little by little, or maybe you should try using a ranged weapon from the very beginning. So it all depends on many things, and it really makes you think of what the other combatant is going to choose. And for example, maybe that enemy decided to use his mystic forces to attack you, but you decided to take cover, and because of that his attack is released and misses because you have already taken cover. So it feels very active in a way. And the combat here is quite deep and simulationist, because, for example, when you make an attack, it's going to target a specific area of your opponent. It's quite possible to cut off someone's hand, and that warrior will keep on fighting even though he has a hand missing, and if he's lucky, he may even survive that combat. So it's a very it's a deep combat system with a lot of options and ways to outmaneuver your opponent and take a bit of a risk when carrying out different actions. And there are also ways to set up defenses, both in a physical defense or a mystical defense. So for example, if you decide to use your shield, the shield is one of the best ways to protect yourself, but there are strategies that an enemy can use against your shield, like moving past your shield and attacking you. And some of the tougher opponents, let's say you are fighting an opponent twice your size, even if you use your shield, it's possible that you will still feel a bit of damage because of the recoil or the impact against your shield. So sometimes it's better to dodge, or sometimes it's better to attempt a parry, but each form of defense or avoidance carries its own risk. So this is a combat system to make you think. And now let's talk a bit more about the differences between Dragon Knights and Enchanters. First, let's talk about Dragon Knights. A Dragon Knight is a Shinkai that can turn into a dragon. You can assume the form of a dragon with increased attributes. You are capable of unleashing breath attacks. You grow scales, you can fly. There are many things related to Dragon Knights, and each of the intelligent races has its own shape when that race turns into a dragon, and with its own characteristics and advantages. Some of the dragons are faster than others, some have spikes, some are very strong, etc. So that's quite nice. And enchanters specialize in wielding the mystic forces. They feel a lot like a combined version of wizard and healer. So in my opinion, I don't have a lot of experience with the system, but in my opinion the Dragon Knight feels quite superior to the enchanter during bursts, because you can't be in dragon shape all the time. There's a certain limit, but during those moments you are far superior in combat to the enchanter. But curiously enough, I felt like the enchanter had a bit more of a steady what would you say, staying power in combat. You just need to manage your enchantments and your spells or mystical forces, and you will be able to heal yourself and others and attack your enemies. So for example, the magic here is quite standard when compared to other role-playing games, half of it at least, but there are some very alien spells. For example, you have a spell that makes a metal sweat acid, and there's a way to use the air to communicate things through whispers. But other than that, you also have your effects of destruction and protection and healing, so that's quite interesting. You also have runes, how to etch the runes to empower different things with effects and create portals and such. And there are also mechanics to kill runes so that the magical effect is no longer applied. You also have universal talents. If you thought that because of your specialties you were still too specialized in some things, there's a list of universal talents that can give your character a bit more usefulness and versatility in different situations. And let's talk a bit more about character advancement, because character advancement in this game feels very... you can personalize the way in which your character becomes better and better. Unlike some other fantasy role-playing games in which all of your qualities and abilities and traits level up at a steady pace, you choose through a point-buy system, you choose what you wish to level up. If you want your character to specialize in using the mystic forces, you can go ahead and leave everything else behind. It may not be advisable in certain situations, but you have the choice to do so. And the points that you gain to level up are also quite versatile. That is, you do get points for killing monsters, but you could also get points just by fulfilling different objectives and role playing, because you can also add flaws to your character, and if you role play those flaws, you're going to get more points. So you choose the way in which you level up and the way in which you gain those points to level up. And you have information on how to survive in Oreathar, all the information related to the environment and coin and health and fatigue, etc. And a great section on game mastering. You have a lot of advice on how to run the game, on if you wish to use some gaming aids such as miniatures and such, or other types of tools, and you have advice on how to handle different plot hooks and situations with players and such. And you have a bestiary at the end of the book. Now the creatures here, some of them feel somewhat normal, but most of them have their own alien feel to them. If there's a recurring theme, it would be the elemental theme. You're going to find creatures related to water and ice and fire and such. But you also have the corrupted creatures and the corruption creatures who seem quite mutant and demonic. There's also a force effect that allows you to mutate your enemies, so that's quite cool and nice. And when it comes to a level of power, as you become better at wielding the mystic forces or at fighting, you will gain the mark. And the mark unleashes the potential of your character in extraordinary ways. The Dragon Knight gains this ability to unleash this very powerful silver breath attack, and the Enchanter has this capability of almost unlimitedly casting spells if he's lucky. So you'll be casting spells non-stop, because there's a limit to casting spells. The spell casting in this system feels somewhat more organic. That is, it's not a Vancian system in which you have a number of spells per day. It's more like a point based system as well, and everything just meshes together quite interestingly. Now let me tell you what I think of Mystic Forces 2nd edition. This is definitely not a beer and pretzels role-playing game. If you're looking for something with very simple rules and then you can play without paying attention, this is not it. This is a very deep system. It asks of you to be aware of things, to pay attention. Each type of Shinkai, and even that is the Dragon Knight and the Enchanter, feels very different from each other. And even, for example, you have several Dragon Knights and Enchanters, the way in which you can customize them by using talents and such, they are all going to feel quite different, especially more so because of the intelligent races. I think that you should definitely give this a try. Even if you're a veteran player, you will find some things here that you probably haven't seen in other fantasy role-playing games. And if you are just getting into the hobby, don't feel overwhelmed by the richness of the setting, by the vastness of the entire thing and the system of rules. You can use things, add things little by little to your game. And this is a game that feels like really feels like a universe to explore. I haven't scratched not even the tip of the iceberg. This is a very deep, complex, and I believe fulfilling system and campaign setting. Well, thanks for watching my review. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know. See you later.